And here we are in the third part of our lecture on East Asia. And again, this one's just going to focus back onto China. And we're going to start with the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty, which had reigned for 132 years before our class even starts, saw economic growth in the last 150 years or so of its existence. Trade with Europe and economic growth created vibrant elite classes, who created novels, operas, poetry, porcelain, and painting, which exemplified and promoted Ming Dynasty culture. But despite these achievements, economic growth could only go so far. Environmental factors played a part in China's future, or history, as the case may be now. The Little Ice Age was a drop in annual temperatures, and it reached a low point in 1645 and remained low through the early 1700s. The resulting agricultural distress and famine fueled huge uprisings that sped the end of the Ming Empire. Other developments from the New World, including the flooding of the market with silver, caused price inflation for goods. Despite agricultural knowledge of new African and American crops gained from European traders, farmers were slow to change their ways. Neither the rice-growing regions in southern China nor the wheat-growing regions in northern China experienced a meaningful increase in productivity. After 1500, economic depression in the countryside, along with waves of epidemics, kept the rural population in check. In cities, corruption, disorder, and inefficiency led to strikes and protests in cities. But the biggest threat to the Ming Dynasty came from beyond the borders. The Manchus, an agricultural people northeast of China and north of Korea, were growing stronger. The Imjin War had caused the Ming Emperor to look to the Manchu for assistance in fighting Japan, but the Manchu took the opportunity to invade Beijing in 1644. Upon the Manchu invasion, the Ming Emperor hanged himself rather than surrender. The Manchus claimed China for their own and initiated a new dynasty called the Qing Dynasty. The Han Chinese make up about 90% of the population today. They were the majority, but the internal weaknesses led to the takeover by the Manchus. So, as we saw when the Mughals took over India, there was a minority population ruling over a majority. In the case of the Mughals, it was based on religion. In the case of China, it was ethnic ties. The Manchu, or Ching Emperor, declared that both Han and Manchus were Chinese, and he rewarded Han Chinese generals who served the Manchu. Still, there were some cultural changes. The Qing Emperor ordered that women had to end the practice of foot binding, and ordered Han Chinese men to shave their heads except for a queue. It's kind of like a ponytail in the back. This order, seemingly trivial to us, provoked outrage and protest, and led to massacres. Failure to abide by those haircut regulations could result in death. Emperor Kangxi oversaw the greatest expansion of the Qing Empire. What started out for the Manchus as a small area of control north of Korea became over time what is now China. Plus, they controlled most of Mongolia as well. In fact, Emperor Kangxi personally led the troops in the campaigns that brought Inner Mongolia under Qing control. The map here shows all the territory. Well, the northern extent of the Qing Empire will cause the Qing to come into contact with another empire. Guess who? The Muscovite conquest of Siberia in the 1580s gave the landlocked Muscovy a giant transcontinental empire, which they hoped to use to get into the thriving markets and trade with both European neighbors and China. In Siberia, and especially the Amur River Valley, the Russians saw a sort of new world. They had dreams of valuable furs, fertile fields, fish, and gold. They soon realized that the fields were not fertile, nor were there heaps of gold. However, there were people there, and the sable furs, which commanded high prices. Sable is a kind of animal. They were also close to China, and thus, in the 1650s, the Russians began to build forts around the Amur River Valley. In addition to the control of resources, the Russians hoped to gain control over the Mongolian nomads, which might be useful to have if they ran into trouble with the Qing dynasty. As it happened, the Dour people already paid tribute to the Qing officials. The Dours paid tribute to both the Russians and the Qing. Let's talk about being a rock and a hard place there. The Chinese and Russians came to a head at one of the Russian fortresses, Albazin. In 1652, Manchu warriors of the Qing attacked the fort, but soon retreated. 6 years later, though, in 1658, the Qing destroyed the fortress and killed everyone in it. After that, the Amur River Valley was sort of a chaotic no-man's land. The Russians wound up rebuilding, and in 1685 the Qing destroyed it again. After a second rebuilding, the Qing lay siege to them, cutting off their food supply. When about 60 or so men were left in the fort, the Russians sent for help and soon announced that an ambassador would come to make peace. Both Qing and Russian officials entered into negotiations with a lot of distrust. This was not the first incident between the countries, and it wasn't the only bone of contention. In fact, the Qing dynasty had been trying to capture a Mongol chief who had switched allegiances from Qing to Russian, and when the Tsar refused to turn him over, the Qing Emperor refused any trade offers from Russia. Both of the empires came in with a lot of ignorance about each other's past, their cultures, and ways of life. It would have been easy for them to refuse to negotiate at all and settle everything on the battlefield. However, both sides began to see a mutual benefit from peaceful relations and tried to avoid warfare. Negotiations for the Treaty of Nerchinsk took many days. Jesuit missionaries Jean-François Gerbillon and Thomas Pereira served as interpreters of both language and cultural norms between the Russians and Chinese. The Russians preferred sitting in chairs, the Qing officials preferred sitting on pillows on the floors. Each one got to exercise their own cultural norms during the negotiations. The Jesuits also translated the treaty into Latin so that both sides would have a working copy in a common language. The Russians had a Polish priest who knew Latin, and the Jesuit missionaries worked with it as well. The Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 dealt mostly with trade between the two countries and established a border between the two. For trade, both countries agreed on free trade between the two, so that means no taxes, tariffs, customs, what have you. Also, they allowed for the free travel of official representatives between the two countries. In terms of the border, the Russians agreed not to rebuild the fort at Albazin and move the location of another fort. Both agreed to keep a depopulated zone between the Amur River and the Argun River. The border established in the treaty is still more or less the border today, with the exception that they don't fight over who has control over the Mongolians. The loyalty of the nomadic Mongolians was just as important as the actual delineation of the border. These mobile people provided a part of each of their respective countries' armies. In the treaty, they ended up dividing up the Mongolian nomads almost like they were picking people for a kickball team in gym class. The treaty was a remarkable success. It was a clear victory for diplomatic relations and for cross-cultural exchange. And while these expanding empires fought battles, they avoided any major conflict or even a war. And though they had deep distrust and probably still some trust issues after the treaty, the nations met as equals. This mostly benefited the Russians, probably because it meant the Russians gained access to the Chinese market without having to wage a war. Getting back to trade with other Europeans, to maintain control over trade, facilitate tax collection, and suppress piracy, the Qing permitted just one marketplace for each of the European countries. That place was Canton, or today's Guangzhou. This system worked until the late 1700s, when Britain was worried about a massive trade deficit with China. The directors of the British East India Company hoped for limitless profits off of Chinese trade, especially tea. Tea became increasingly popular and fashionable among the elites in British society. In fact, it made up 10% of all trade. They couldn't get enough of the stuff by the 1770s, when a bunch of Americans would dump it in the harbor. The Qing Empire took payment in silver only, and rarely bought anything from Britain. With domestic revenues declining in the late 18th century, the Qing government needed silver, and was disinclined to loosen import restrictions. To make matters worse, the East India Company had managed its worldwide holdings badly, increasingly intrusive. Thus, the British government decided to send someone with experience dealing with Russia and India to work on getting trade with China. In 1792, Lord George McCartney, a well-connected diplomat and trader, was dispatched to China to negotiate with the Qing Emperor Qianlong. He arrived in 1793, the next year. He arrived to court and portrayed himself as just there to celebrate Qianlong Emperor's 80th birthday. The court manners were very strict. The visitors had not only to bring a gift or tribute, but also to kowtow to the emperor. These two rituals could make or break a mission. Well, Lord George McCartney brought a tribute gift, but refused to completely kowtow. Instead, he bowed to Qianlong as if he were bowing to King George. This was not a good sign of things to come. The Qianlong Emperor received McCartney but refused to alter the Canton trading system, open new ports of trade, or allow the British to establish a permanent mission in Beijing. The Emperor sent a letter to King George III explaining that China had no need to increase its foreign trade and had no use for British goods. This was a devastating blow as far as trade was concerned, but the British were not alone in their failures. Dutch, French, and Russian missions also failed. European frustration mounted and admiration of China faded. This would set the stage for conflicts to come between England and China. But let's get back to Qianlong's point about not needing British goods. Since 1500, China's population boomed, tripling in size to about 350 million people in the late 1700s. Just to put that in perspective, the American population hovers around 325 million, and it's the year 2020. China's population was more than double that of Europe, and despite the adoption of some New World crops, especially sweet potatoes and corn, population pressure touched off social and environmental problems. As increased demand for building materials and firewood shrank the woodlands, deforestation accelerated wind and water erosion and increased flooding. Dams and dikes were not maintained, and silted-up river channels were not dredged. By the end of the 1700s, parts of the 1,000-year-old Grand Canal linking rivers of North and South China were nearly unusable, and the towns that bordered it were starved for commerce. Some interior districts responded by increasing output of export goods like tea, cotton, and silk. Peasants found work in agriculture or in cities as barge pullers and human waste carriers. Begging, prostitution, and theft increased in cities, and rebellions broke out in flood-ravaged southwestern and central China. Indigenous people concentrated in the less fertile lands. The Qing Empire was not up to controlling its vast holdings. It was twice the size of the Ming in terms of land, but did not increase its bureaucracy to deal with all the holdings and the people. The rise of the Qing was over, and decline was setting in. The Qing held on, though, until 1910, when revolution ended the Qing Dynasty and began the Republic of China. But we'll get to that later on in the course. That wraps up the third part of the lecture on East Asia. I'm going to have a quiz this week. It'll be on Blackboard, so be sure to stay tuned for that. And that will be appearing after Thursday, or after Friday, I guess, really, because we're technically still Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I will post it up on Friday. You will basically have the weekend to complete it. It should be done by next Monday. Monday. I hope the system is working out. If not, shoot me an email, awarwick@montgomerycollege.edu or alisa.warwick@montgomerycollege.edu. Either one works. And let me know what you think. You can also leave comments below. If you have any questions or anything, I will try to respond to those. Until next time.